Recently, I released this video, a video going deep into the lore provided by the story The Mimic from Tales from the Pizzaplex Book 6. I think you should go watch that video before this one if you haven't already. However, I think the least popular part of that video was that I came up with the idea that the theory known as Stitchline games is true, but not that the Stitch Wraith Stingers happen before Security Breach, but rather that they happen after Security Breach. This was understandably not a very well received idea, and I completely expected that, and I understand why completely. However, in that video I also offered another, at the time in my opinion slightly less likely option, split line games. But using all the evidence that we have, which option is more likely? That's what we'll be talking about today. I wanted to do a follow-up discussing whether or not Stitchline games is actually the more likely option, or if it's just a close second to split line games. So some of you may be wondering what these theories actually are, so allow me to explain. Stitchline games is the theory that states that all the Stitch Wraith Stingers, as well as the stories connected to them, all take place within the timeline of the FNaF games. Splitline games, on the other hand, suggest that all the Stitchline aspects, like the existences of Andrew and Eleanor, that happened prior to the events of FNaF 6 are in the games, but that after FNaF 6, the timeline splits in two directions. The book direction, where all the Stitch Wraith Stingers happen, and the game direction, where the Pizzaplex opens over the pizza place, preventing the Stitch Wraith Stingers from happening. However, you may be wondering why I'm actually making this video. I mean, what actually makes me think that either of them are canon? Well, in my theory video on the Mimic, I went over the main reasons that I believe Stitchline games was canon, so I'll basically go over the same points again, though I'll try to shorten it a bit. One of the most controversial parts of the Stitchline games theory is the existence of the character Andrew, who is clearly meant to either represent or be the one you should not have killed from Ultimate Custom Night. However, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that Cassidy is actually the vengeful spirit. The Old Man Consequences minigame from Ultimate Custom Night, as well as the final cutscene, show that a Golden Freddy spirit is in control, and Princess Quest shows off a very similar scene to that Old Man Consequences minigame, implying that since Cassidy is the player of one, she's probably the player of the other. There's also the fact that Cassidy's name was confirmed canon in the Fourth Closet, which actually came out literally one day before the debut of the Vengeful Spirit in Ultimate Custom Night. However, our mistake was assuming that the one you should not have killed and the Vengeful Spirit were the same person. Andrew in the Fazbear Frights epilogues is described as having a very rough and angry voice, which doesn't actually match the voice of the Vengeful Spirit, which also sounds more feminine. But is that really enough to say that they're different characters? Who cares, because there's actually more. In Ultimate Custom Night, it's made extremely clear that Golden Freddy is in control of the situation, which is why it's so strange to have Andrew be wearing a green alligator mask. Throughout the series, spirits always wear the masks of the animatronics that they possessed, so why would Andrew be wearing an alligator mask unless he possessed an alligator animatronic? Since the Frights books are made to fill in gaps, this would imply that both a spirit possessing Golden Freddy and a spirit possessing an alligator animatronic were in control of William's torture. And while there are only two brainwaves in William's head by the man in room 1280, it's extremely possible that Cassidy has already left Ultimate Custom Night, which makes sense given what we see in Ultimate Custom Night itself, where Old Man Consequences tells a Golden Freddy silhouette to rest, and then the final cutscene is of Golden Freddy disappearing into fog, implying that Cassidy leaves. It makes a lot of sense that Andrew does exist in the games as a sort of forgotten victim. The one problem was that up until now there was no reason to believe that there was an alligator animatronic in existence that Andrew could have possessed while Afton was still around to kill him, which would have been in the 80s or maybe early 90s. However, the Mimic offers a solution to this. Edwin's job is to use the costumes Fazbear Entertainment sent to him and turn them into animatronics. He does this with Chica, Foxy, and Bonnie in this story. However, one of these costumes that would be turned into an animatronic is an alligator costume. Fazbear Entertainment had an alligator costume in the 1980s, which perfectly aligns with Andrew being killed by William and wearing an alligator mask. While Edwin doesn't end up finishing this animatronic, Fazbear Entertainment would obviously have eventually made these characters into their respective animatronics, meaning that we now know for a fact that Fazbear Entertainment did have an alligator animatronic in the 80s, perfectly aligning with Andrew's existence like I said. Lally's Game and Frailty both seem to have Eleanor existing, and since Tales from the Pizzaplex does take place within the game's timeline, that would imply that Eleanor exists, so I think those are pretty decently solid pieces of evidence that either Stitchline games or Splitline games is true. It's just a matter of which one. But before we do that, we need to lay a couple ground rules. First, when Security Breach takes place. The Mimic programming as seen in the Storyteller is very clearly the glitch trap virus, and since it replicates what it observes, it's heavily implied that the Mimic witnessed William murdering the missing children. That means that the first half of the story, The Mimic, takes place in 1984, given the second half is a few months later and in the following year, and still before the missing children incident. Edwin in the Mimic is 24, and in the Storyteller he is 64, so doing some quick math, we can find that the Storyteller takes place in 2024. According to the 19 quarterly Pizzaplex FazLife magazines, the Pizzaplex has been open for almost 5 years, and 2029 matches the calendar found in Security Breach. So Security Breach takes place in 2029, and the Pizzaplex would have opened less than a year after FNaF 6. This is problematic considering that in the man in room 1280, which is at the very least after the events of FNaF 6, the doctors claim that the man has been there for years. However, some people have been arguing against this, saying that the nurses were lying, which I guess I could see, but there's also the fact that there was a billionaire who bought this hospital 10 years ago and changed the design, adding in black and white tile floors. What does that remind you of? To me, it seems like this guy bought the hospital and intentionally made it look more like a Fazbear building. But why would he do that? Because of the man in room 1280. It adds up with something else we see in Out of Stock, where a billionaire continuously buys out the Emporium, which sells Fazbear-related merchandise. It seems like a billionaire is buying out Fazbear-related locations, which could also tie into Security Breach itself, with the new CEO possibly being a billionaire in a similar regard, or depending on the end result of this video, the same guy buying these buildings and companies. However, if the billionaire bought the hospital 10 years ago because of the man in room 1280, that means the man in room 1280 was there for 10 years. But of course, that's not certain, that's just a theory. But the man in room 1280 does cause other problems. For instance, Fetch. Andrew says in the 4th Fazbear Frights epilogue that he got into the Fetch animatronic in the distribution center following the events of the man in room 1280, but by the time of the Fetch story, Fetch is in an abandoned Freddy Fazbear's pizza location. Now, it's obvious that they wouldn't deliver Fetch to an abandoned building, so essentially what this all means is that Fetch takes place many years after the man in room 1280. There's also a kid named Jake in Fetch who is 4 years old. Jake in the real Jake is 9, so if this is the same Jake, it would have to be 5 years before the real Jake, and in turn the Stitch Wraith Stingers, which Epilogue 2 tells us only happened likely a few months after the real Jake. It is of course possible that this isn't the Jake from the epilogues and the real Jake, but I think that it most likely is, considering both stories do take place past modern day, and Fetch is the same book that shows Margie in Evan and Jake's house following the events of the real Jake, so it likely is the same Jake. But even if it wasn't, many years still have to have passed since the burning of FNaF 6 between it and Fetch, and Larson himself absolutely confirms this. According to Larson, the FNaF 6 fire is so far in the past it was almost ancient history in the department, and that doesn't at all match just being a couple months old. What's left behind is no space whatsoever for the Stitch Wraith Stingers to happen between FNaF 6 and Security Breach. So what does this mean? Well, this works fine under Splitline games, but under Stitchline games, does it make sense for the Stitch Wraith Stingers to be after Security Breach? There's pros and cons, so let's start with everything that supports Stitchline games being the correct option. The labyrinth of FNaF 6 is underneath the actual pizza place, and Vanessa had to actively use Freddy to dig underneath it. That essentially means that Afton's body is under there, still trapped, preventing his body from being taken out and into Heracles Hospital. That would mean that whether Stitchline games or Splitline games is correct, the man in room 1280 can't be right after FNaF 6 because it would have to be sometime later, something that could possibly be explained in Ruin, with Burntrap probably combining with the Blob, eventually getting out from under the Pizzaplex, and his body being removed from the Blob, getting defeated and sent to the hospital. There's also Lally's Game, which takes place at the very least a couple decades after the Pizzaplex shuts down. Eleanor in the final epilogue of Fazbear Frights brings Larson into a memory of something very similar in description to the attic from Lally's Game, and at the end of Lally's Game, the shadow, which is Eleanor, is heavily implied to be the one behind it all. But if that memory is shown in the epilogues, that would mean that the epilogue had to take place after Lally's Game, which would imply that they're in the same timeline branch. There's also the question of how Funtime Freddy appears in Count the Ways, which is after FNaF 6, and Stitchline games would explain this, as we have the FNaF AR Fazbear Funtime service, which could be the source of this Funtime Freddy, and that explanation would not be offered by Splitline games. And finally, there's just the argument of why there would be a split in the first place. What's really the point of having a split where Eleanor rises to power and Afton dies if they're just gonna have both of them probably still around in the games anyway? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But then, what implies that Splitline games is more likely? There's first a couple pretty simple arguments, like the fact that the puppet shouldn't be in the evidence locker if it's still down with the Blob, or the fact that it has tear tracks in the epilogues but not while it's in the Blob. The Pizzaplex also isn't mentioned in the Stingers, which would be very strange if it was built over the pizza place. But while these pieces of evidence can be explained away, they can't really be explained in an extremely satisfying way. However, there's just one last piece of evidence that essentially destroys Stitchline games, and it's something that I didn't even remember when I was making my Mimic Theory video. While the FNaF 6 building isn't visited from our perspective in the Frights epilogues, it is actually revealed that the Stitch Wraith is seen there, and not only is it seen in that area, it was seen looking around the site of the fire, which means that the fire was still above ground and that the Pizzaplex was not built over it. So since the Stitch line can't be before security breach, and it also can't be after it, that means that the most likely option is split line games. The Stitch Wraith stingers don't take place in the direct timeline of the games, but rather in a timeline branch that was created following FNaF 6. The evidence that supports Stitchline games over Splitline games can also be explained away pretty easily. In FNaF 6, Henry claims that there was a way out planned for Mike, one that the animatronics wouldn't find, but that he would if he were to choose to. If you can get out through it, you could definitely get in through it. It's possible that due to the immediate construction of the Pizzaplex, the police didn't have a whole lot of time to investigate, so they probably weren't able to find that way in. But in the Stitchline, there was no Pizzaplex limiting the investigation time, allowing them to find the way in, find the man who would go to the hospital, and also allow them to find the puppet. Regarding Lally's game, there was a very similar situation with You're the Band. You're the Band has the Shadow as the main antagonist, and the story appears as a memory in the final epilogue, just like Lally's game has the Shadow as the antagonist and also appears as a memory in the final epilogue. The issue is that You're the Band has the abandoned Freddy Fazbear's building, which doesn't match with the fact that that Freddy's building, a few years after the closing and for the decades onwards, was changed and morphed tens of times into various different restaurants and bought by many companies, meaning it doesn't make sense to be an abandoned Freddy's in 2015, when You're the Band takes place. That all means that You're the Band, despite having the Shadow as the antagonist and appearing in the final epilogue, is not a part of the Stitch line, unlike what I used to believe, so it's very likely that Lally's game is the same way. It's possible they appear in that epilogue just to lead us towards realizing that the Shadow in both those stories is Eleanor, just like in the Stitch line. Regarding the Count the Ways argument, the final epilogue reveals that Count the Ways was Eleanor's doing, meaning Funtime Freddy there was probably created by her. I just said whore, meaning that Funtime Freddy there was probably created by her. Or instead, it could be possible that he came from Circus Baby's Pizza World, which in Dance With Me reopens, and Dance With Me is a part of the Stitch line, so that would add up. As for why Scott would do a split in the timeline, it could just be simply to offer us an alternate perspective on the timeline that provides hints for the future of the main timeline while also providing us with interesting stories to read. There's just one loose thread with all of this though. Because the timeline splits after FNaF 6, everything that happens before FNaF 6 still happened in the past of the Stitch Wraith timeline. That means that the Mimic still exists, but because there's no Pizzaplex, the Mimic has no opportunity to become Burn Trap, so what happens to it? Is it just an untied string? Maybe, but while it doesn't have too much evidence, it's entirely possible that the Mimic is the endoskeleton that is used for the Stitch Wraith. It does add up with the fact that the Stitch Wraith has no endoskeleton head, and Edwin bashed the Mimic's head in, so it matches that in that regard, and that's why the head is replaced in the epilogues of Tales from the Pizzaplex. Both endoskeletons do have a ribcage, and both have an intense amount of agony within them, so it does make sense that Phineas would have collected such an endoskeleton for this type of experiment. But again, that's just a small idea. Does its Mimic 1 programming really do anything for the Stitch Wraith? Seemingly not, but it would just tie up that loose thread and would be pretty interesting. But that's all that there is to talk about for this video. I hope you all enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to. Let me know what you think about this theory, and tell me if you agree that Splitline games is the most likely option, if you believe Stitchline games, or if you believe neither. Any option I would completely understand, as I have my own beliefs, and I'm sure yours differ from mine. My next video will be going over the trailer for the Ruin DLC, so stay tuned for that, but with all that being said, I'll see you all in the next video. Bye guys!